The story of Dan Bogan begins with a mystery so old and so strange that even today, people still whisper about it. When they speak his name, they speak it with a mix of fear, admiration, and curiosity, because Dan Bogan was not like other men of the Wild West. He was faster, he was braver, he was more loyal, and above all, he was a man who refused to live by anyone else's rules. Dan Bogan lived during a time when the American frontier was filled with danger. Dusty towns, open plains, long cattle drives, gunfights, and outlaw riders were all part of daily life. People had to be tough just to survive. But even among these tough people, Dan Bogan stood out. Nobody knows the exact date of his birth, but most believe he was born in the early 1860s in Texas. At that time was a land of heat and dust, wild horses, and endless sky. Life was hard, but the freedom was real. Children grew up learning to ride horses almost as soon as they learned to walk. And from the moment young Dan first sat on a saddle, it was clear he had a gift. He rode like the wind. He handled a horse as if he and the animal shared one mind. People around him often said, "That boy is different." And they were right. As a child, Dan was quiet but strong. He didn't talk much, but he noticed everything. He watched how the older cowboys worked, how they roped cattle, how they fought, how they survived. He learned fast. He learned by watching, and he learned by doing. By the time he was a teenager, he was already one of the most skilled riders in his county. But riding was not his only talent. Dan had sharp eyes, steady hands, and quick reflexes. He became an excellent shot with a revolver and a rifle. He did not practice to show off. He practiced because he believed a man should always be prepared. In the West, danger could appear at any moment. A rattlesnake, a cougar, a thief, or a drunken cowboy could take a life in seconds. Dan understood this, and he prepared himself for whatever the future would bring. When he reached adulthood, he began working as a cowboy, traveling from ranch to ranch. He worked hard, earned little, and slept under the open sky. But he loved the life. He loved the open range, the long rides, and the feeling of wind hitting his face as he galloped across wild land. However, something else shaped Dan Bogan, something deeper than skill or survival. It was loyalty. Dan believed in standing by the people he cared about. If a friend needed help, Dan was there. If someone was bullied or treated unfairly, he stepped in. And in the West, standing up to powerful men could be dangerous. During this time, America was changing. Big ranchers were buying more land. Barbed wire fences were blocking old trails. Cowboys who once roamed freely now found themselves pushed aside. Many felt angry and hopeless. Dan understood their frustration, and he refused to let rich landowners walk over working men. This strong sense of loyalty, justice, and independence would eventually shape his future and lead him toward trouble. People who met Dan always remembered him. He was not the loudest man in the saloon. He did not brag. He did not start fights. But everyone could feel something in him, something tense and powerful, like a storm waiting to break. His eyes were sharp. His tone was calm. But when he made a promise, he meant it. When he gave his word, he kept it. And when he said he would stand by a friend, he would stand until the very end. This quality earned him respect. It also earned him enemies. As the years passed, stories about Dan began to spread across Texas and Wyoming. Some said he was a hero. Others said he was trouble. The truth was somewhere in between. Dan was simply a man who lived by his own code. A cowboy who protected those he cared about. A rider who believed freedom was worth fighting for. But the West was changing fast. The open plains were disappearing. The power of wealthy ranchers and lawmen was growing. And soon, Dan would be caught in the middle of a conflict, much bigger than himself, a conflict that would push him toward violence, force him to run from the law, and eventually turn him into a legend. But before all of that, before the gunfights, the escapes, and the mystery of his disappearance, Dan Bogan was just a quiet, determined cowboy. A young man with a strong heart and a fearless spirit, a man who dreamed of living free. And little did he know, the choices he was about to make would carry his name into history books and make him one of the most mysterious outlaws the world has ever known. This is the beginning of the story The story of Dan Bogan, the outlaw who vanished. Asterisk, as Dan Bogan grew into a young man, the world around him was changing faster than anyone expected. The Wild West was still wild, but it was no longer free. New laws, new fences, and new power groups were rising across Texas and Wyoming. For many cowboys, this change felt like a slow storm building on the horizon. But for Dan Bogan, the storm was already beginning to touch his life by his early 20s. Dan had gained a strong reputation. Everyone who worked with him described him as steady, fearless, and honest. He was the kind of cowboy every ranch wanted to hire, but also the kind of man trouble seemed to follow. Not because he caused it, but because he refused to bend when others did. Cowboys at that time lived hard lives. They rode long distances, sometimes for weeks, pushing cattle through heat, dust, and storms. They ate simple food, wore clothes, until they turned to threads, and slept wherever they could. For this difficult work, they were paid very little. And yet, they kept going because it was the only life they knew. Dan understood this life deeply. He respected it, and he respected the men who lived it. But powerful ranchers, the cattle barons, were taking more land, hiring private guards, and controlling entire regions. They decided who worked, who earned, and who suffered. Many cowboys felt trapped, but not Dan. He believed that no man should control another man's freedom. One cold evening, after a long day working cattle, Dan sat around a campfire with other cowboys. They talked about the fences going up across the plains, the rising tension, and the unfairness they saw every day. Some were scared, some were angry, but Dan listened quietly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. One cowboy finally said, "We need someone who will stand up for us." Another added, "Someone who doesn't back down." All eyes turned to Dan. He did not ask for attention. He did not give speeches. But the cowboys respected him because he lived the way he spoke, straight, honest, and unafraid. And slowly, Dan's presence became something more than just another rider on the trail. He became a symbol. Dan wasn't trying to lead anyone. He simply cared about fairness. And in a world ruled by force, fairness could be dangerous as weeks passed. Small conflicts began turning into large arguments. Lawmen hired by the powerful ranchers didn't just enforce laws, they enforced the wishes of the men who paid them. They threatened cowboys, arrested them without cause, and used fear to break their spirit. Dan couldn't stand watching this. Whenever a cowboy was mistreated, Dan stepped forward. Whenever someone was bullied, Dan stood between them and the men breathing threats. He didn't look for fights, but he didn't avoid them either. Word spread quickly. Dan Bogan stands for the working man. He doesn't fear the cattle kings. He fights back. People admire a man like that, but those in power hate him. By the mid-1880s, the Wyoming Range Wars had begun bitter disputes between wealthy ranchers and cowboys who wanted a fair chance at life. Small misunderstandings turned into arguments. Arguments turned into threats. Threats turned into violence. Dan found himself caught in the middle, not because he wanted to fight, but because he refused to watch innocent men suffer. One afternoon, Dan witnessed a ranch owner's enforcer strike a young cowboy across the face. The cowboy was barely 17, frightened and alone. Dan stepped forward without thinking. "Leave the boy alone," Dan said calmly. The enforcer laughed. "And if I don't?" Dan's silence was enough. His calmness was something men feared more than anger. The enforcer backed down, but he didn't forget the humiliation. Days later, Dan learned that the same enforcer was telling others, "Bogan needs to be taught a lesson." And in the West, lessons were taught with bullets, but Dan didn't change. He kept working. He kept helping those who needed him. His actions, quiet but firm, put him on a list of men the ranchers considered dangerous. And it wasn't long before lawmen began watching him too. One night, while Dan slept in a bunkhouse, a group of cowboys whispered nearby. They were afraid. Someone had been arrested unfairly. Someone else had disappeared after arguing with a ranch foreman. Tension was growing. They asked Dan, "What should we do?" He looked at them for a long moment. Then he said something simple. "Stand together. That's all we've got." This was Dan Bogan's nature. He didn't want power. He wanted justice. But justice in the West often required crossing dangerous lines as he rode through dusty trails and worked long days alongside honest men. Dan didn't know that every act of loyalty he showed was pushing him closer to a moment that would change his life forever, a moment when a single spark of conflict would turn him into a hunted outlaw. The plains were getting quieter. The nights were getting colder. The tension between cowboys and ranchers was building like a storm, preparing to strike. And in the center of it was Dan Bogan, a quiet cowboy with a fierce heart, a man who believed in fairness, a man who soon would face the greatest challenge of his life. The story was only beginning. The growing tension between cowboys and powerful ranch owners did not fade. It grew heavier, day by day, like dark clouds gathering before a storm. And in the middle of this rising conflict stood Dan Bogan, a man respected by many, feared by some, and watched closely by the law. By now, Dan understood that life on the open range was not the same life he grew up with. The fences, the new rules, and the control of wealthy landowners had tightened around honest, working men. Cowboys whispered that something terrible would happen soon. Everyone could feel it in the air. Don, however, kept working, kept riding, and kept standing up for the men around him. But trouble was moving toward him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. One cold morning, Dan and a group of cowboys rode into a small Wyoming town to pick up supplies. The town was quiet, with wooden buildings lined along a dusty street. The saloon doors swung lazily in the wind, but something felt wrong. The townspeople looked nervous. They avoided eye contact. Men stood a little too stiff. Women closed their doors quickly. Dan sensed danger. He always trusted his instincts, and this time they were sharp as a knife. When he approached the general store, a lawman stepped onto the boardwalk. This was Deputy Charlie Gunn, a man known for pushing cowboys around and taking orders from the ranch barons. He was the kind of lawman who believed power meant control. The moment Deputy Gunn saw Don, his eyes narrowed. Well, he said, resting one hand on his holster. If it isn't Bogan. Don stayed calm. Just here for supplies, deputy. No trouble. But Gunn didn't want peace. He wanted to prove a point. You've been causing problems, he said loudly, making sure the whole street could hear him, talking big, getting cowhands riled up, thinking you're some kind of hero. Dan didn't look away. I stand up for what's right, he replied simply. Gunn stepped closer. And that's the problem. People inside nearby buildings peeked through windows. They knew something dangerous was about to happen. Don tried to walk past, but Gunn blocked his path. The deputy's voice rose, sharp and angry. You don't belong here, Bogan. You think the rules don't apply to you? You think you can challenge the ranchers and walk away untouched? Dan kept his voice steady. I don't want trouble today. But Deputy Gunn did. He shoved Dan hard in the chest. The street went silent. Dan stumbled back a step, but still kept his hands away from his gun. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but Gunn's pride couldn't accept that calmness. He wanted Don to react. He wanted a reason to shoot, draw. Gunn shouted suddenly, "Draw your gun, cowboy." Dan's heart pounded. He could feel the heat of danger. He could feel every eye in the town watching him. If he drew his weapon, the law would call it aggression. If he didn't, Gunn might shoot him anyway. Gunn reached for his pistol. Everything happened fast. Too fast. A gunshot exploded into the morning air. For a moment, Don didn't even realize the shot came from his own hand. Instinct had taken over. Dan was skilled, fast, and reacting to save his own life. And in that split second, he fired before Gunn could pull the trigger. The deputy stumbled, dropping to his knees, gripping his side where the bullet struck. He wasn't dead, but he was badly wounded. The town erupted into shouts. People ducked into buildings. Horses panicked. Dan stood frozen, his breath short, his heart racing. He had not wanted this. He had not planned this. But now, the line had been crossed. Within minutes, other lawmen appeared, guns drawn, shouting orders. Dan's cowboy friends yelled for him to run. Go, Dan. Get out of here. Dan hesitated. He didn't want to run. He didn't want to leave the town, the men he worked with, or the life he knew. But he also knew that if he stayed, he would be arrested, beaten, or worse. and no law in that town was on his side. He backed away slowly, then sprinted toward his horse. Bullets flew past him. Deputies shouted his name. Dust rose in clouds as Dan mounted his horse and kicked it hard. The horse bolted down the street and out of town, leaving behind chaos, screams, and the wounded deputy. That was the moment everything changed. From that day forward, Dan Bogan was no longer just a cowboy, no longer just a man standing up for others. He was now a wanted outlaw accused of attacking a lawman, hunted by authorities, and marked by the ranch barons who already despised him. His life on the open range was over. His life as a fugitive had begun. As Dan rode into the wilderness, the cold wind cut across his face. He didn't know where he would go or what would happen next. But one thing was clear. The world he had known was gone, and the storm he had been sensing for months had finally arrived. Dan Bogan rode hard through the open plains, the wind tearing at his coat, his heart pounding like a drum inside his chest. Behind him, the quiet little town he had entered for supplies was now a place he could never return to. A single moment, a desperate reaction to save his own life, had changed everything. With one gunshot, Dan Bogan had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For the first few miles, he didn't think. He simply rode. He urged his horse faster, feeling each powerful stride as it carried him farther away from danger and deeper into the unknown. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the cold morning air slowly turned warm, but Dan felt none of it. His mind was spinning. He had never wanted to be an outlaw. He had never wanted violence, and he certainly had not wanted to shoot a lawman. But the West was a place where moments happened fast, so fast that life could change, before a man even understood what he had done. As the town faded behind him, Dan reached the ridge overlooking the open country. He stopped, breathing hard. His horse, tired and trembling, snorted softly. Dust floated around them. Dan looked back, half expecting to see riders chasing him already. The horizon was empty, but he knew they would come. Lawmen didn't stop once they marked a man as dangerous, and powerful ranchers did not forgive. They wanted to make an example out of him, to show every cowboy what happened when someone dared to push back. Dan wiped sweat from his forehead and whispered to his horse, "We keep moving." He turned toward the tall grasslands and rode deeper into the wilderness. For the next several days, Dan stayed away from towns, roads, and ranches. He rode through quiet valleys, across dry riverbeds, and between lonely rock formations where only the wind spoke. At night, he slept lightly with one hand near his gun, listening for footsteps or distant hooves. He avoided campfires. He avoided trails. He became a shadow moving silently, unseen, forgotten by the world except for the men hunting him. Each morning, he woke up with the same thought. How long can I run? Dan was not afraid of hardship. He had lived a cowboy's life all his years. What troubled him was the truth he could no longer ignore. The law would not listen to reason. They would not care that he acted in self. They would not care about the deputy's reputation for provoking fights. They wanted a criminal, and now they would paint him as one. The newspapers would call him dangerous. The ranchers would call him a threat, and the law would call him a fugitive. The world had already made up its mind. 2 weeks after the shooting, wanted posters began appearing across Wyoming and parts of Texas. They showed Dan's face calm, serious, and determined. Wanted. Dan Bogan, armed and dangerous. Reward for capture, dead or alive. People whispered about him in saloons. Some said he was a hero who had only defended himself. Others said he was becoming a wild outlaw. Stories spread, twisted by fear and imagination, and every rumor pushed Dan further into hiding. He heard about the posters from a traveling cowboy he trusted, a man who found him camped in a narrow canyon. "They're looking for you, Dan," the cowboy said quietly. "Harder every day." Dan nodded, though the weight of the words hit him like a hammer. He thanked the man, shared what little food he had, and then moved on before dawn. He couldn't stay in one place for long. Dan traveled through rugged terrain, choosing paths where only deer and wild horses walked. The land was beautiful, but lonely. Tall cliffs cast long shadows across the ground. Rivers cut through stone like silver threads. Sometimes he saw eagles circling high overhead. Sometimes he saw nothing at all. He thought about his life, often everything he loved about the open range, everything he tried to protect, and he wondered how it had come to this. But the more he thought, the more he understood a hard truth. Freedom had always had a price, and now he was paying it. Still, Dan refused to give up. He refused to let powerful men decide his fate. He was determined to keep moving, keep thinking, keep surviving, and he hoped, deep in his heart, that someday he might clear his name. But hope alone couldn't protect him. Asterisk. As days passed, the lawmen searching for Don grew more serious. They followed tracks, questioned travelers, and checked every abandoned cabin and canyon they could find. Riders spread out across the plains. Posters were nailed to every post. Dan knew he couldn't outrun them forever. Sooner or later, they would corner him. And when they did, he would have to choose: surrender and face a hanging, or fight until he couldn't fight anymore. Neither choice gave him peace. One evening, after hours of traveling through rocky hills, Dan reached a high overlook. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. He sat there silently, watching the colors fade. He thought of the cowboys he helped. He thought of the life he'd lost. And he thought of the moment, the deputy fellow moment, that played again and again in his mind. He whispered to the sky, "I didn't want this." The wind carried his words away. But the world didn't care what he wanted. The chase was on, and Dan Bogan was now the most hunted man in the region. Asterisk, the hunt for Dan Bogan grew more serious with each passing week. What had started as a local search turned into a wide chase across the plains. More lawmen joined the effort. Rewards were increased. Newspapers printed exaggerated stories about him. Some painted him as a violent outlaw. Others called him a folk hero. But none of these stories helped Dan. They only made the search tighter. Dan kept moving through wild land, surviving on small amounts of food and whatever water he could find. His horse grew thinner. His clothes became worn and dusty. But still, he pushed forward. He knew that stopping meant danger. Stopping meant getting caught. But no man can run forever. And one cold night, Dan's luck finally began to run out. Asterisk, it was early winter. The wind cut sharply through the canyons, and frost covered the grass each morning. Dan had ridden deep into a narrow valley, hoping the rough terrain would hide him. His horse stumbled as it crossed a patch of loose rocks, leaving fresh marks on the ground. Don didn't notice, but a deputy named Wilson did. Deputy Wilson was an experienced tracker. He didn't chase hard, he chased smart. He followed the smallest clues: a horseshoe print, a broken branch, a piece of cloth caught on a thorn. He moved quietly, studying every detail like a hunter stalking his prey. On that cold morning, Wilson found the fresh hoof marks. He knelt down, touched the soil, and felt the dampness. "Not more than 3 hours old," he whispered. That was enough. He signaled for the other deputies. The chase had narrowed that asterisk that evening. As Dan rested inside a shallow cave, he heard something in the distance. A faint sound, a rhythm, a pattern he knew too well. Hoofbeats. He stood and listened, his jaw tightening. The wind carried the sound again closer now. Slowly, he packed his saddlebag, tightened the straps on his horse, and prepared to ride Dot. Before he left the cave, he looked back once. He felt a small ache in his chest. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being hunted for defending his own life. But the world didn't care about exhaustion. It cared about survival. He swung into his saddle and rode out into the growing darkness. Asterisk, the deputies spotted him just before sunset. Dan saw them on a distant ridge, dark figures on horseback, silhouettes against the orange sky. And then the chase began. Dan pushed his horse hard. The animal galloped across open ground, its breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Behind him, the deputies shouted for him to stop. Gunshots cracked in the distance, echoing through the hills. Don didn't shoot back. He never fired unless he had no choice. He only kept riding, hoping he could reach thicker forests where the lawmen's horses would slow down. But as the night deepened, the terrain grew harder. Loose rocks, hidden holes, and steep slopes made riding dangerous. Dan knew he was risking his life every second he stayed in the saddle. Suddenly, his horse stumbled, not enough to fall but enough to slow. And that was all it took. Within moments, the lawmen were close. Too close. A deputy swung a lasso through the air. The rope flew out like a snake and tightened around Dan's arm. His horse reared, startled. Dan was pulled from the saddle, crashing hard onto the ground. He groaned, the air knocked from his lungs. Before he could reach for his revolver, a boot pressed onto his hand, pinning it down. A voice shouted, "Don't even think about it, Bogan." Dan looked up. Lantern light flickered across the faces of angry lawmen. Dust floated around him like smoke. He knew the chase was over. They tied Dan's hands behind his back with rough rope. His wrists burned as the deputies yanked the knots tight. 2 men lifted him and pushed him onto a wagon. His breath was slow. His body hurt. His mind was a storm of disappointment and frustration. "Deputy," Wilson climbed into the wagon beside him. "You should have kept running," Wilson said, not unkindly. "The law never stops." Dan looked at him, his expression calm but exhausted. "I did run," he replied quietly, "but a man can't outrun lies." Wilson didn't answer. The wagon rolled forward. Dan watched the stars above him. He had always loved the wide sky, free, open, endless. But now he saw it through a small wooden frame, with iron chains clinking beside him. The men guarding him whispered, "He's dangerous. He's clever. He's finished." But Dan felt no fear. He felt sadness. Not for himself, but for the truth that nobody cared to hear. In their eyes, he was the villain now. The outlaw, the troublemaker. And soon, he would face trial. The ride back to town. When Dan arrived back in town, crowds gathered to see him. Some looked at him with pity, others with hatred. Some whispered that he got what he deserved. Others said the law should leave him alone. But one thing was clear. Dan Bogan was no longer just a cowboy. He was the man who had shot a deputy. He was the fugitive captured after weeks on the run. He was now the most talked about prisoner in the region. They locked him in a cold, small jail cell. Metal bars, stone walls, and a future full of uncertainty. Dan sat quietly on the edge of the bunk, staring at the floor. His days of freedom were over. His trial was coming, and the world was ready to judge him. The jail cell where Dan Bogan sat was small, cold, and built from rough stone. A narrow bunk sat against the wall, and the only light came from a barred window near the ceiling. Through it, Dan could hear distant voices, townspeople talking, horses moving, lawmen shouting orders. Life outside continued, but inside that cell, time seemed frozen. Dan had survived storms, long cattle drives, and gunfights. But this was different. He could ride away from danger, but he could not escape the walls around him. Now, the law held his life in its hands. For days, Dan said little. He ate quietly, slept lightly, and watched every shadow in the hallway. Some guards showed him a bit of respect. Others mocked him, calling him the famous outlaw, or the cowboy who thought he was above the law. Dan ignored their words. He knew the real danger wasn't the guards. The real danger was the trial, and it was coming fast. News of Dan's capture spread quickly. People from nearby towns traveled miles just to see the dangerous fugitive who had fought the law. Women whispered. Men argued. Children snuck near the jail to get a glimpse. Some believed Dan was innocent. Some believed he was a killer. Most didn't know what to believe, but one thing was sure. Everyone wanted to see how the trial would end. Local newspapers printed dramatic stories. Bogan the outlaw captured. Trial expected to be most important in years. And powerful ranchers, the same men who disliked Dan's influence among the cowboys, wanted the trial to be quick and harsh. They wanted Dan to be an example proof that no one could challenge their control. On the morning of the trial, Dan was brought from his cell and taken to a small office inside the courthouse. A man in a worn coat waited for him. He introduced himself as Samuel Thorne, a lawyer from another county. "I've come to represent you," Thorne said, offering a firm handshake. Dan looked at him with suspicion. "Why would you help me?" "Because," Thorne replied, "I don't believe the whole story they're telling." Dan studied the lawyer's face. He saw seriousness there. Honesty, and maybe even courage. Dan nodded slowly. Thorne laid out the truth. The town wants a conviction. The ranchers want you gone. And the law wants a quick win. They will twist this case against you, no matter what. Dan sighed. I shot the deputy. I can't deny that. Yes, Thorne said, but you shot to protect your life. And that matters. Dan felt a small spark of hope, something he had not felt in weeks. The lawyer gave him a final warning. Stay calm in the courtroom. Don't react to insults. Don't let them paint you as angry or dangerous. Don agreed. By afternoon, the courtroom was packed. People crowded every bench, stood along walls, and pressed their faces near windows. The air felt heavy, full of tension and curiosity. Dan was brought in wearing irons around his wrists. Gasps filled the room. Some people stared with fear, others stared with fascination, and a few nodded with quiet respect. Thorne walked beside Dan, whispering, "Stay steady. Don't let them see fear." Dan's face remained calm, his stride steady. Even in chains, he carried the dignity of a man who had lived through hardship and survived. The judge arrived. The room quieted. The trial began. The prosecutor, a sharp-tongued man supported by wealthy ranch owners, stood tall and confident. He wasted no time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the defendant is not a hero. He is not a victim. He is a violent outlaw who shot a lawman in cold blood." The crowd murmured loudly. He ran from the law. He hid like a coward, and now he stands before you, pretending his actions were justified. Dan clenched his jaw, but stayed silent. Every part of the prosecutor's speech twisted the truth, painting Dan as a monster, not a man trying to survive. Witnesses were called. Some deputies described Dan as wild or dangerous. Others claimed he had caused trouble months before. Even though those stories were exaggerated, the prosecutor's goal was clear: destroy Dan's character before he could defend himself. When it was time for the defense, Samuel Thorne stepped forward with calm confidence. "Dan Bogan is not a villain," he said firmly. "He is a hard-working cowboy who acted in fear for his life." He called witnesses who knew another cowboys who spoke of his loyalty, honesty, and quiet nature. They told the court how Deputy Gunn had provoked fights before, how he pushed men around, how he tried to humiliate Dan that day. One cowboy said clearly, "Deputy Gunn reached for his gun first. Don reacted because he had no choice." The courtroom buzzed. Thorne continued, "Don didn't run because he was guilty. He ran because he knew the law would not protect a poor cowboy over a powerful deputy." The argument hit hard. Some people nodded. Some whispered. Even the judge seemed thoughtful. Dan felt that spark of hope grow. Despite Thorne's strong defense, Dan sensed the outcome. Too many powerful men wanted him convicted. Too many voices shouted louder than truth. The atmosphere felt heavy, unfair, unbalanced. When the jury left to decide, Don sat quietly. He didn't fear death. He didn't fear prison. What he feared was being judged for a crime he never meant to commit. Hours later, the jury returned. Their faces told the story. The judge read the verdict, guilty. A wave of emotion swept the room. Gasps, whispers, shouts. Don lowered his head, not in shame, but in understanding. The world had chosen its story, but Don Bogan's story was far from over. After the verdict was read, silence filled the courtroom like a heavy blanket. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The judge's words hung in the air like a final blow. Guilty. Don Bogan stood still, not angry, not surprised, just deeply disappointed. He had known this was coming. The trial had felt decided long before he entered the courtroom. Powerful ranchers wanted him behind bars. The law wanted a victory. And even though his lawyer, Samuel Thorne, fought bravely, the truth could not break through the wall built against him. A guard stepped forward and grabbed Dan's arm. "Let's go, outlaw," he muttered. The word outlaw echoed painfully in Dan's mind. He had never thought of himself that way. He had never tried to be one. But now the world had given him that name, and there was no taking it back. The guard shackled him and led him out of the courthouse. A crowd waited outside, buzzing with excitement, fear, and curiosity. Some people stared with cold eyes. Others whispered softly, "Poor man, he didn't deserve this." But none of their opinions mattered anymore. Dan Bogan was now officially a convicted man. Asterisk, the jail cell he returned to felt even colder, even smaller than before. The iron bars seemed thicker. The shadows seemed darker. And for the first time since his arrest, Dan felt truly trapped. He sat on the rough bunk, staring at the floor. His wrists were bruised from the handcuffs. His shoulders ached from the long days of tension. But the pain inside his chest felt heavier than anything else. Thorne visited him that evening. "I'm sorry," the lawyer said quietly. His voice trembled, carrying real emotion. "You tried," Dan replied softly. Thorne nodded. "They want you gone, Dan. They want the cowboys quiet. They want the ranchers in full control." Dan lifted his head. "What happens now? You'll be transferred soon," Thorne answered, "to a bigger prison, a place you won't escape." Dan stared at him for a long moment. "Is there any hope?" Thorne hesitated. "Not with the law. Not now." And with those words, the lawyer left. Dan closed his eyes. He knew he had only two choices: accept a life behind bars, or find a way out. And Dan Bogan was not a man who accepted a cage. Asterisk, days passed. The townsfolk moved on, but inside the jail, tension grew. Rumors spread that Dan would be moved within a week. Guards talked loudly, hoping to scare him. "You won't see daylight again. You think running before was bad. Try running from the state prison. You're finished." Bogan. But Dan listened quietly, and in their words, he found something important. They underestimated him. One night, just before sunrise, a storm rolled in. Thunder echoed across the sky. Rain hammered against the roof. Lightning flashed like cracks in the darkness. Inside the jail, most guards sought shelter in the office area, staying warm and dry. Only one guard, a young man new to the job, remained at the far end of the hallway. Dan sat still on his bunk, watching the shadows flicker with each flash of lightning. A plan formed in his mind, not reckless, not foolish, but sharp and desperate. The kind of plan a cowboy makes when his back is against the wall. And fate had given him the perfect moment. Asterisk, just after midnight, the storm grew worse. The wind howled. Wooden signs slapped against buildings outside. The young guard sat nervously in his chair, tapping his foot. Dan stepped quietly to the bars. "You all right there, son?" he asked calmly. That the guard jumped a little. Fine. You look cold," Dan said, voice gentle. The guard didn't answer. He was inexperienced, scared, and distracted everything Dan needed him to be. A loud thunderclap shook the building. The guard stood and walked down the hall, checking for leaks from the storm. His keys jingled at his waist with each step. Dan watched carefully. When the guard paused to inspect a dripping ceiling tile, Dan acted. He reached through the bars swiftly, silently, and with surprising strength. He grabbed the guard's vest and yanked him close. Before the young man could scream, Dan covered his mouth. "I don't want to hurt you," Dan whispered, "but I won't die in a cage." The guard shook nervously. "Eyes wide, drop the keys," Dan ordered. With trembling fingers, the guard let them fall. Dan reached, dragged the keys toward him, and unlocked the cell door with steady hands. When the door swung open, he whispered, "Stay quiet. You'll be fine." He tied the guard loosely, leaving him unharmed. Dan wasn't cruel. He only wanted freedom. Asterisk, Dan slipped down the hallway, moving like a shadow. The storm outside masked his footsteps. The howling wind covered any sounds he made. When he reached the back door of the jail, which he knew was often left unguarded during storms, he pushed it open and stepped into the night. Got cold rain hit him instantly. The wind whipped around him, soaking him to the bone. But the storm felt like a blessing, wild, fearless force helping him disappear. He hurried to the sheriff's stable behind the building. Lightning lit the sky, revealing the shape of horses inside. Don chose a dark brown mare, swift.com, and strong. He saddled her quickly, despite the rain, and whispered, "Help me get out of here." The horse snorted, as if she understood. Dan mounted, turned toward the open plains, and kicked the mare into a gallop. The storm swallowed him whole. Behind him, the jail remained silent. The guards wouldn't discover his escape until morning, and by then, Dan Bogan would be long gone. The outlaw had escaped, but the world would not forget him, and the chase was about to begin again. The morning after Dan Bogan's escape arrived quietly. The storm had passed. The sky was clear. The town breathed gently, unaware of the chaos waiting to unfold. Then, a scream shattered the calm. He's gone. The prisoner's gone. Guards rushed into the jail. The tied young guard sat on the floor, unharmed but terrified. The back door swung open in the breeze. The cell stood empty, and the news spread faster than wildfire. Dan Bogan had escaped. Within an hour, the sheriff called together every deputy in town. Men saddled horses, loaded guns, and formed a search party. The sheriff barked orders. He couldn't have gone far. The storm slowed him. Find him before he disappears into the plains. But the storm had been Dan's greatest ally. The heavy rain washed away tracks. The wind scattered his scent, and the darkness swallowed him whole. By the time the sun rose, Dan was already miles away. Dan rode through wet fields, across muddy trails, and into hilly terrain where the land rose and fell like broken waves. His brown mare moved fast despite the slippery ground. Her breath puffed in the cold morning air. Dan leaned low, speaking softly to her. Just a little farther. Just a little more. His clothes were soaked from the storm. His body ached from the chase, the fall, the weeks in jail. But his spirit was sharp. His mind was clear. He had a second chance. He would not waste it. Dan didn't ride toward towns. He didn't ride along roads. He turned toward the deepest wilderness, the places only outlaws, hunters, or desperate men traveled. Towering pine trees, rocky ridges, narrow ravines, cold streams. He followed a path few would dare to take. He wanted to disappear, and in the mountains, a man could vanish like smoke. Meanwhile, the lawmen gathered in larger numbers. Deputies from other counties arrived. A group from the Wyoming Stock Growers Association joined the hunt. They were not looking for justice. Many of them wanted revenge for Dan's defiance, for his influence among cowboys, for the embarrassment he brought to those in power. Newspapers printed bold headlines. Dangerous outlaw on the loose. Manhunt for Bogan intensifies. Some claimed he had help. Some claimed he broke out with explosives. Others said he planned the entire thing months. Earlier, that truth was simpler. Dan saw a chance and he took it. But the rumors fueled the chase. Dozens of riders fanned out in every direction. They searched canyons, trails, forests, and riverbanks. One deputy said, "He can't outrun all of us." Another replied, "You don't understand, Bogan. He's not like other men." After hours of riding, Dan found a small cabin hidden deep within the trees. It looked abandoned, broken window, missing shingles, a collapsed porch, but it was shelter, and shelter meant survival. He dismounted slowly, guiding the exhausted horse to a small patch of grass and removing her saddle to let her rest. Dan's muscles burned. His hand shook, but he stayed alert. Inside the cabin, he found dry wood, a rusted lantern, and a blanket full of holes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He built a small fire, teeny, controlled, hidden, just enough for warmth. As he sat near the flames, he let his mind breathe for the first time in hours. He replayed everything. The fight with the deputy, the trial, the harsh verdict, the escape during the storm. He whispered into the quiet cabin, "Why did it have to come to this?" The fire crackled softly. The only answer was the wind outside. Dan wasn't a violent man. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't the outlaw people said he was. He was a cowboy caught in the gears of a world that had stopped caring about men like him. He wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and closed his eyes. But he didn't sleep long. At midday, the mare suddenly lifted her head, ears pricked forward. Dan's eyes snapped open. Horses. Somewhere close. He crawled to the window and peered out far in the distance. Among the trees, he glimpsed movement. Dark shapes, riders. The law had found his general direction. Dan's heart hammered. He had to move. He saddled his horse again, ignoring the pain in his arms. He gathered the few supplies he had, and before leaving the cabin, he paused and whispered, "Thank you for the shelter." Then he rode out the back way up a steep slope, through thicker trees, taking a path no sane man would choose. He didn't have to outrun the riders. He only had to stay ahead of their guesses. Lawmen reached the cabin an hour later. They found warm ashes, fresh hoof prints, and clear signs that Dan had been there. "He's close," the sheriff growled. "Keep riding." But the forest was too thick, the ground too uneven. The tracks disappeared into tangled brush. As night fell, the riders argued. Some wanted to turn back. Others wanted to press forward. Some insisted Dan had help. Others believed he was hiding in the shadows. Watching them, the truth was simpler. Dan was just smarter than they expected. In the days that followed, the chase continued. Riders appeared in valleys and disappeared. Camps were made and abandoned. Clues were found and lost. And slowly, the story began to shift. People whispered, "He's impossible to catch. He moves like a ghost. He's always one step ahead." Dan Bogan was no longer just a fugitive. He was becoming a legend, a man the frontier itself seemed to protect, a man the law couldn't corner, a man who refused to be broken. But legends can't run forever, and soon Dan would face the greatest decision of his life. Third person, simple English. Voiceover ready. The hunt for Dan Bogan stretched into weeks, then months. What had begun as a determined chase slowly turned into confusion. The deputies pushed deeper into the wilderness. They followed every rumor, every broken branch, every whisper from travelers passing through. But each trail ended the same way. In silence, Dan Bogan was gone. Not captured, not killed, just gone. It was as if the land itself had swallowed him. Back in town, people argued about what had happened. Some said he had frozen to death in the mountains. Others insisted he had escaped into New Mexico. A few claimed he had help from friends among the cowboys. Every saloon had its own version of the story. He crossed into Mexico at night. No, he hid in a miner's shack near the mountains. You're all wrong. He took a train under a false name. The truth was simpler and stranger. Dan Bogan had vanished so completely that no one, not even the most skilled trackers, could follow him. Some lawmen began to believe he had died out there, but others, the ones who studied his habits and admired his skill, said, "No, he's alive. A man like Bogan doesn't die that easily." Yet no body was found. No stolen horse showed up. No tracks reappeared. It was the perfect disappearance. Far from the towns he once rode through, Dan settled into the most unlikely refuge, a small canyon deep in the mountains, hidden by jagged rocks and thick trees. It wasn't marked on any map. Travelers rarely passed by. Even animals seemed to avoid it. For Dan, it was the safest place he had ever found. His mare grazed peacefully on small patches of grass. A clear spring flowed nearby. The canyon wall sheltered him from wind and hid him from anyone searching above. During the first days, Dan barely slept. He expected riders to appear at any moment. He kept his rifle close and woke at every rustle of leaves. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And still, no one found him. Slowly, the tension in his body loosened. Slowly, his heart beat more calmly. He felt like a stala, but invisible. And maybe that was exactly what he needed to survive. The quiet nights in the canyon gave Dan time to think, time he never wanted, but desperately needed. He thought about the young deputy he had shot. Even though Dan had fired in fear, the memory haunted him. He didn't wish harm on anyone. He didn't want to be known as a killer. He thought about the trial, the injustice, and the faces of the ranchers who smiled when he was found guilty. He remembered the lawyer who tried to help him, the cowboys who believed in him, and the people who watched silently as the law twisted his story. He wondered what his life could have been if the deputy had not pushed him that day, if he had walked away, if he had kept quiet when men were mistreated. But Dan wasn't built to stay silent. He wasn't built to stand by and watch others suffer. He was built for open land, loud skies, and the truth even. When the truth was dangerous, months passed. The law eventually slowed its search. Riders went home. Rewards grew dusty on saloon walls. Life in the frontier moved on, but strange stories began to circulate in New Mexico. Someone claimed they saw a quiet cowboy with a familiar face working at a remote ranch in Colorado. A trapper swore he crossed paths with a man who looked just like Don, a man who smiled gently, thanked him for directions, and rode away before he could ask questions. In Texas, an old woman insisted she recognized Dan's voice when a stranger bought supplies from her. Shop late at night. None of these stories were proven. None were certain, but the rumors kept Dan's memory alive. He became a shadow appearing and disappearing, not caught, not confirmed, just whispered about. Some said he had cut his hair short, shaved his beard, and changed his name. Others said he lived among native tribes, learning their ways. A few believed he crossed into South America, where a cowboy could vanish completely. And the strangest part, every version seemed possible. As the years went by, Dan Bogan transformed from a hunted outlaw into a legend, a symbol of rebellion, courage, and the fight for justice. Cowboys told stories around campfires. Bogan didn't die. He found freedom. He rides the hills when the moon is high. Whenever you see a lone rider on the ridge, that's him. Watching, children grew up hearing tales of his escape. Young cowhands admired him as a hero. Old-timers nodded quietly when his name was mentioned, as if remembering something too complicated to explain. Even the men who once hunted him admitted. No one ran like Bogan. No one disappeared like him. He fooled all of us. Dan had become more than a man. He had become a mystery. And mysteries last forever. Somewhere perhaps in Mexico. Perhaps in a quiet New Mexico valley. Or perhaps in a place no one ever discovered. Man lived a quiet life under the name Jim, or Daniel, Boone, or Don, or something else entirely. He worked with horses. He kept two. Himself. He rarely spoke of his past. If someone asked where he came from, he answered simply, far away. And that was enough. Because the truth didn't matter anymore. The world believed Dan Bogan had died, or disappeared, or become a ghost of the plains. But maybe he lived out the rest of his life in peace. Far from the noise, far from the law, far from the world that once chased him, a free man. Years passed after Dan Bogan slipped away from the world. The frontier continued to change. Towns grew larger. Railroads stretched farther. Barbed wire divided the open plains. The Wild West, the world Dan once knew, was slowly fading. But the stories about him did not fade. They grew stronger, while the law once chased him with anger. Time gave Dan something he never expected, a legacy. His name, once spoken with suspicion, was now spoken with wonder. Men told tales of him. Women repeated stories they heard from fathers and grandfathers. Children listened with wide eyes, imagining a lone cowboy riding across moonlit hills. Dan Bogan had become more than a man. He had become a legend. Cowboys, sitting around evening campfires, talked about him as if he were still alive. He stood up for us, one would say. He didn't bow down to the ranch kings. Another added, he wasn't perfect, but he had guts. It didn't matter that the real story was tangled with fear, injustice, and pain. What mattered was the idea of Dan Bogan, cowboy who fought back, the man who chose freedom over surrender. Old ranch hands spoke about him with quiet respect. They remembered how he defended young riders. They remembered how he never backed away from trouble when someone needed help. They remembered his calm voice, steady eyes, and strong sense of fairness. Even those who had once feared him began to see him differently, because time has a way of smoothing rough edges, and sometimes time turns outlaws into heroes. The farther west people traveled, the more the stories changed. In some places, Dan Bogan became a brave gunslinger who stood alone against corrupt lawmen. In others, he became a ghost-like figure who appeared in the mountains to warn travelers of danger. Some said he could ride faster than any man alive. Others swore he could move silently through forests without leaving a single footprint. Of course, none of these tales were completely true, but legends rarely are. What mattered was the truth behind them, that a man had refused to give up his dignity, even when the world tried to take it away. As the country moved into a new century, strange whispers continued to surface. Travelers reported seeing an older man who looked familiar. A man with tired eyes, strong hands, and the quiet presence of someone who had lived through enormous struggles. A rancher in New Mexico claimed he hired a mysterious worker who never spoke of his past, but who handled horses with unmatched skill. A hotel owner in Colorado described a man who checked in under a false name but spoke with a calm Texas accent. In a small village in Mexico, people talked about a tall, quiet stranger who lived simply and helped anyone who needed it. None of these sightings were confirmed. None of them were disproven. But each story added another brushstroke to the myth of Dan Bogan on Outlaw who refused to die in chains. A man who walked into shadows and chose a life unknown to the world. If Dan was alive during those later years, he likely lived simply. He would have cared for horses, cooked his own meals, and walked long distances alone. He would have avoided crowds, avoided arguments, avoided anything that could lead back to his old identity. But he would not have been unhappy. Dan never wanted wealth or fame. He never wanted trouble. All he ever truly wanted was freedom, the freedom to ride where he wished, to speak the truth, to stand for what felt right in his heart. And so, living quietly in some remote corner of the world might have finally given him what life had denied him for so long. Peace. No one knows when Dan Bogan died or where. No records exist. No grave bears his name. The world simply stopped seeing him one day, as if he slipped into the earth itself. Some say he died alone, under a wide western sky. Some believe he lived with friends who kept his identity secret. Others imagine him riding one last time, disappearing into the horizon just as the sun went down. But perhaps the truth is not meant to be found. Perhaps Dan chose to leave this world the same way he once escaped the law, quietly, calmly, with no trace left behind. And maybe that was his final act of freedom. Even now, more than a century later, Dan Bogan's name remains part of Western folklore. Not because he was perfect, not because he was invincible, but because he was real, made of flesh, blood, courage, and fear. A man pushed by injustice, shaped by loyalty, and driven by the belief that every person deserves a fair chance. Dan's greatest legacy is not the escape, nor the manhunt, nor the mystery. His legacy is the message his life leaves behind. A man can lose everything: home, reputation, freedom, but still refuse to surrender his spirit. And that is why Dan Bogan, the cowboy who vanished, still rides in the stories told around campfires, in books written across decades, and in the hearts of those who still believe in the untamed spirit of the old American West. Dan Bogan disappeared, but his story never did.